Hello, everybody, and welcome to our next healing conversation. I'm Rachel Singleton, and I'm here with
Ian Watson.
And today we're going to talk about diagnosis and how that can help us, hone in on something, and how that can also define us, and how that sometimes might not be very helpful. So maybe we can start with thinking about what is the diagnosis. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a great topic because often getting a diagnosis seems like the necessary starting point when people are ill, and let's say they're in the position where they don't know, they have the feeling, I don't know what's wrong with me. So that gives rise to a lot of fear, a lot of anxiety, a lot of insecurity. And I think that often brings the impulse, I want someone to tell me what it is, someone who knows better than I do, which is a very understandable thing. When people are in an unknown place within themselves, it's very understandable that we look to someone to just to make sense of it for us.
Yeah.
But I don't know what's going on right now with my body or even with my mind. Maybe if your expertise or your experience, if you can bring that to bear, you can shed some light on that for me.
Yeah, so, absolutely. Yeah.
That's like the starting point, I think. What we don't necessarily realize at that point is that diagnosis has implications.
Mm-hmm.
Some positive, some not so. It also breeds potential limitations. In fact, in some sense, every diagnosis, I would say, brings limitation with it, because at the end of the day, it's a viewpoint. And that viewpoint is based on a particular perspective, a particular way of looking at health and disease and the body and your place in the bigger system. So depending on who you go to, I don't mean which person necessarily, but I mean what kind of practitioner, what kind of framework they operate within, you're going to get a very different kind of diagnosis, which is going to have very different implications for the resulting treatment.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we can see a diagnosis as, I guess, the recognition of a constellation of symptoms that have that they're all seen to be part of an underlying condition, that we see them as going together. And that helps us therefore to frame and hone in on this and what might be then the core problem behind those symptoms. So it helps us to give it a container, doesn't it? So suddenly we're not like just going into free fall thinking what on earth is happening to my body or what is happening to my psyche, but we actually have this way of being able to contain it. It brings it down to size, it makes it more manageable, and it can be reassuring. It can be frightening sometimes, the diagnosis, but it can also be very reassuring. But within that fact that it is defining something, and therefore by its very nature, it is defining us in a way, or defining our health in a way. Then the type of diagnosis depends on the medicine system, the belief system, the framework that's surrounding that. And I'm sure we can kind of think of examples between us. I'm like something that traditional Chinese medicine might see as being like excess damp in the body or weakness in the lung, might be labelled catarrh or asthma by the medical profession, or it might be like through a shamanic tradition or something like that, it might be seen sitting on, or something sitting on our spirit, something that's kind of expressing our expression, our heart, our joy. Or in homeopathy, it might be seen as the tubercular miasm coming through, and that susceptibility there. Or it might be, if we listen to our grandmother, her telling us that we're going out with wet hair every morning and we're causing ourselves to have a cold. We have all of these different ways which have their own wisdom and which have their own framework foreseeing something, and which can kind of help us come in and hone in on that causative factor, if you like, which means that then we can target how we address this and how we treat this. So I guess that's part of the positive and the reassuring side of it. And in a way we can select the medicine system that best seems to suit, gives us the most full and comprehensive and meaningful understanding of what's going on. We don't have to just stick with one medical system's diagnosis. We can actually use 2 or 3 to come to our own understanding of something.
I think that right there, that's a really powerful thing for people to realize, is that you can be given a diagnosis which sounds plausible and might look like the only way of considering what's going on to the person that's telling you this. This is the story. This is what it means. It's very powerful to realize that you could literally walk out of that practitioner's door, go 100 yards down the street, and have a conversation with someone else who's equally experienced and qualified, but in a different field, or a different perspective. And not only the diagnosis is different, but the prognosis is profoundly different. That was a mind blower to me when I realized that what really makes the difference between whether someone is, let's say, curable or incurable, it depends on who's looking.
Exactly.
It's not a fixed thing. And in that sense, no diagnosis is absolute. And I think that's the first thing that I encourage people to be open to, is not to see a diagnosis as being fixed and an absolute. It's not a definition of truth, of fact. It's only ever a perspective.
And that's, again, that's more empowering. We can get a diagnosis which can help us, but we can also see that the diagnosis is from within a particular, albeit very comprehensive system. It's from within a particular system. So if we want to, we can look beyond that system as well. We can still stay within that. We can still accept the treatment of that, but we can also draw on other systems and other treatments.
Yeah. Not only that, there's another layer to it, which is that even within the one system, different practitioners will have a different perspective. So it's even, it's multifaceted, which is why, people can go, sometimes they have the experience of going the rounds of various doctors or practitioners, and then they finally, they hit on someone and they say, I finally found one that really, that really understood me. And the person feels, this is the one I can trust. And there's something in that, even though the previous 3 people that they saw were trained essentially in the same system, there was something in the way that person maybe listened or heard, or they had a way of reflecting back what they saw as what was going on that was more meaningful for the individual. So I think this is an interesting part of it also, is that, to me, the only diagnosis that's really useful is one that when you hear it, it's meaningful to you.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That
it actually, you can recognize, there's something helpful in that for me that I hadn't considered, and that maybe I wouldn't have come to by myself.
And inherent in that is a sense that person has seen us more completely, or seen the situation more completely, heard us, listened, and come to a much more fuller and more comprehensive understanding of us. And therefore what comes back to us resonates with us.
That's right. And if you're not getting that from a practitioner, and to me, I don't care what discipline they're working in, alternative, orthodox, it's all the same as far as I'm concerned. If you're not getting that sense that this sits right with me when I hear it, then go somewhere else.
Exactly.
It's allowed.
and this is such a simple thing, but it is not known. It is not universally known or universally understood that we have permission to do this, that we have permission to check this out with various different people, within the same tradition, within different traditions, and that we can use our discernment to see what resonates for us and what doesn't. That we have a level of knowledge intrinsic to us about our own healing, and that we need to be listening to that, and that needs to be part of this conversation. And so our role as the patient is to be feeling for what's right, isn't it? It's to be sensing, as you say, does this have meaning for me? Does this feel real? Does this really encompass what's going on? Or is this just a partial, quick, off-the-cuff summary of something, along with the prognosis that comes with that?
Yeah, and we know the difference.
Yeah,
I would say, even people who would, by default, would tend to give the authority away to someone else for their own healthcare, their own well-being. That person still knows the difference between what you're describing there. I would almost call that a wastebasket diagnosis. It's like it's a very superficial way of describing what's going on. When a person just says to you, "Oh, you've got some kind of autoimmune disease." Well, how's that helpful? Or it's a virus. You're no better equipped knowing that than you were before you knew it. In fact, you might be worse off, because now you're worried that there's something invisible that you can't even see that's doing it to you, that you're a victim of. That's not helpful.
No.
And we feel that, and very often we don't have faith in the treatment when it's predicated on that kind of diagnosis.
Yeah.
So there's that sense of, oh, he told me it was a virus, and then he gave me antibiotics. Antibiotics don't even work for viruses, do they? But I better take them anyway. You can tell that the person isn't really on board with the treatment, because the diagnosis didn't really make sense to them. It didn't really ring true. It didn't bring any depth to their understanding.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily what terminology is the person using. It's more, what's the depth of understanding that's behind what they're saying.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's that we need in order to really be able to point ourselves in the direction of healing.
Yeah.
Because part of what a diagnosis can do, as we were saying at the start, is help us to hone in on where the problem is. Because if somebody comes, for example, with acne, so superficially it appears that they've got a problem with their skin, and a superficial way of treating that might be to slap some creams on some chemicals on there that will suppress or stop that inflammatory eruption from happening so much.
Yeah, makes sense on one level, doesn't it?
It makes sense.
This is where it's visible. Let's make it invisible. Yeah.
Yeah, but if we were to then go deeper and look into what's going on with that person, then maybe we find that there's a problem with their gut, and maybe we find that there's a problem with their diet, and maybe we find that there's a problem with lack of exercise or poor elimination, and so there's nowhere for toxins to get flushed out of the system and the lymphatic system to work properly. There's all manner of different ways in which that could be impacting, or maybe it's a change in the use of product or something that's caused a reaction. So there's so many other ways in which something which appears to be a problem here is a problem much, much deeper inside, and that takes some listening and some investigation to find that.
Right. And again, you could even, something that on one initial impression seems very straightforward. Yeah, it's a localized skin problem. But also, if you're a bit more observant, you can notice what's the person's relationship to that problem as well. Are they very self-conscious about the fact that they've got acne on their face, or they're not particularly bothered? Is it somehow reflective of something that's happening in terms of their own self-image?
Yeah.
And that's often the invisible piece that we can't necessarily immediately see or grasp. But if someone's able to gently reflect that back to us in a way that we can hear it, that becomes the gold, if you like. That becomes the piece that we can really work with, and we can see, there's something in this for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which totally changes your relationship to the same symptomatology. It no longer is now a question of how do I just make this go away and get rid of it. Now it's, oh, that's really interesting, that of all the things that my body could have produced, it just, I mean, I lost count of the number of people that I saw treating skin problems, particularly on the face, whose, let's say, their job it was to look a certain way. It just so happened, you know, that it was
at this time, in this way, in their life, this is what they get.
It was very important to them that, you know, that they had beautiful skin, or that the skin was perfectly clear. And lo and behold, darn, why can't it show up on my leg or somewhere I can? And starting to see that that's meaningful. Yeah. That there's the mind body is also it's one whole system.
Exactly.
And the extent to which we can include all of the relevant elements is the extent to which, again, that diagnosis has the potential to be a significant part of the healing journey for somebody.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because we're helping the person to take into account something that they might never have considered and seen the value of before.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that it's, in a sense, it kind of requires them to go a bit deeper within themselves.
Yeah. So there's also then the danger with a diagnosis that when it pulls our attention into looking at something in a certain way, that it can misdirect us towards fighting off something rather than seeing the gift in that, rather than seeing the wisdom response of the body that's inherent in our wholeness.
Yeah, that's a nice way of putting it. I think, and to me, that will be the essential differentiation, point of difference between what you might call a holistic approach and a non-holistic approach. A holistic approach is always striving, or ought to be at least, striving to be more inclusive, to see what else can and needs to be included in this picture that maybe is being overlooked.
Yeah.
Whereas a non-holistic approach is very much deliberately, in some sense, ignoring a whole bunch of stuff that's also present.
Yeah. And
say, no, this is just a localized phenomena. Let's treat it as such.
Yeah, isolating down onto that.
Yeah, which it's very interesting, because that way of diagnosing in itself is an outcrop. It's a symptom of the kind of reductionist scientific model, which has been predominant for the last, I don't know how many centuries.
Yeah.
So we did the same thing with the material world. You know, we started looking at things, first of all, fairly large objects, and then we started looking smaller, and then we started looking at the components that those objects are made from. This idea of reductionism. If we really understand the individual parts well enough, we'll know something about the whole. Well, yes and no.
Yeah.
It turns out that the more you focus on the individual parts, the more you lose sight of the whole. That's also true. That's the big danger in that. So that mindset, I think, is filtered into medicine just in the same way as it's infiltrated the other sciences. And it's very different to the more traditional ways within our own culture, but also for example, in the Orient, the Eastern traditions, is a much more holistic way of considering health and disease, which is why these have become popular, is because people have recognized the lack.
Yeah. 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 So there's a few things about diagnosis then to be aware of, really. So diagnosis can be incomplete.
I would say it's always incomplete.
Yeah.
Start there.
It can misdirect either through a diagnosis that really is too superficial, or it can misdirect us towards fighting something rather than inhabiting our wholeness. It can come with or impose a prognosis, and that prognosis might be terrifying from one system and very, very different and even liberating from another system. You know, if we just the turnaround from seeing something as something that's been done to us, that's infecting or attacking our body, to seeing this, as you were saying, as an opportunity to look within and see the gift, the gold in it, then that becomes an enlightening and liberating process. And it can also, a diagnosis can become a label by which we're defined. And I hear this with some concern when I hear somebody say my cancer or my ME, and it doesn't have to just be physical. You know, we have other labels, don't we? We have other ways of diagnosing ourselves as introverts or sensitives or, you know, whatever else it might be. So are we, when we become too emotionally involved in and defined by that, then something that was there to help us perhaps focus our efforts and understand something and be a container for something now becomes something that's defining us and limiting us. And we're becoming invested in being that limit self.
It becomes self-fulfilling at a certain point. So I think that's a really crucial thing to recognize, is that when we identify with the label, when we say I am depressed, as opposed to in this moment I'm feeling depressed, there's two very different stories. As soon as it becomes I am, there's an identification with the label as if it were a fixed thing.
So it becomes an end state rather than an energetic state that we are moving through.
Right. It's a dynamic process. It doesn't matter how fixed it appears. It's still a dynamic process.
Exactly.
A tumor in the body is a dynamic process.
It's not the end of the road.
It's not the end. In fact, that tumor is also having cells replicated within it on a daily basis. It's part of the living whole that is the body mind. And in that sense, it can change shape, size, direction, location very, very quickly. And we often, when something seems to become manifest that is just happening to us, you know, it doesn't seem like we're involved in it in any sense, then again, the response to that usually is, well, can someone just take that away? You know, it's nothing to do with me. So if maybe somebody else can just make it disappear. But my own experience with working with a lot of people was that if that's the only place that we meet that health challenge, we just meet it with the relationship to it, that it's a nuisance, it just needs to disappear, then the susceptibility that created that in the first place has not yet been addressed. And there's a high likelihood that something similar or perhaps different will manifest to reflect that ongoing susceptibility. So there's also I think to me, one of the questions with the diagnosis, does it go far enough for you? You know, does it help you go deep enough within yourself so that you can be confident that you're really healthy, you're really healed? Because that is a very different scenario to someone who's had a diagnosis. They've had the treatment based on the diagnosis, but they're living in fear. They're living in fear that they might not have got it all out, or you know, this percentage of people have a recurrence within this many years. You know, people get very fearful about that, about certain outcomes based on statistics, which got nothing to do with you as an individual. We're not statistics. We're individuals, you know. And I think that again, for the diagnosis to be really helpful in an empowering way, it's got to go deep enough.
That's really profound what you're saying there, you know, in that sense of, are we really getting to the core susceptibility, the thing that's behind this? And that is something that's deep within the wholeness of our being, that's called that forth. Are we touching that? Are we addressing that? Are we tending that?
Yeah. And again, we know the difference.
Yeah, we do.
We know the difference, because when someone opens up that conversation with us, even though we might be reluctant to go there initially, we usually are, because it's something that's kind of shadowy for us. It's something that we maybe prefer not to even consider. But when someone opens up that conversation in a way that's really helpful and supportive, it's a relief. Something in us is relieved, and it's like, oh yeah, I can stop running from that now.
Yeah, we get to acknowledge it. We get to speak it.
Yeah. So I think that's part of the healing, potential healing function of a diagnosis, is that it helps to bring something into fuller consciousness for us. But that needs to be a dialogue. That's not one person telling you what's going on. And
it needs to be ongoing in the living moment, because it's constantly changing.
Exactly. Exactly. It's not a one-off statement that's true for all time.
It's a living process.
Yeah. So in that sense, the initial, what's initially revealed as being the diagnosis is the entry point. It's the beginning. It's not the end.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. It's also, I think, one of the interesting things for me about working in the homeopathic field, as you and I both have, is the homeopathy flies in the face of the conventional idea that you can't treat without the diagnosis. I mean, there is a kind of diagnostic procedure that happens within homeopathy, but it's nothing like the labeling of a set of symptoms and saying, this is what's wrong with you. It's nothing like that. It's building up a picture of meaningful associations.
Yeah.
And that picture is unique to the individual. And then recognizing that picture as being somewhat similar to a pattern that's also contained within a remedy. It's a whole different way of approaching. And I remember I've had clients that I've worked with years ago, and I've taken their full case history. It's very clear to me what would be helpful to them in terms of the remedy, but they've been still bothered at the end because I haven't told them what's wrong with them. There was that expectation. Like, I hadn't really fully realized that they were looking for that label, as if it was a necessary precursor to being able to offer a helpful treatment, and it isn't. And I think we overlook that too. That there's many ways in which we self-heal, and we can get help with our healing without ever knowing, in a kind of labeled sense, what it was that we were dealing with.
Yeah, very much so.
We knew that something was off, and often that's all we need to know. And if we listen to that a bit sooner, it wouldn't have to get to the point where it's diagnosable by medical tests and so on. I think that's another helpful piece, is to realize that often the orthodox medical diagnoses are the end of the road labeling. It's labeling what's now become visible, which actually was perceptible months, if not years beforehand. Now, it would have been harder to put a label on it earlier, which is why some of the ways that holistic people talk about disease process sounds nebulous. It's to do with energy and chi and these kind of things, the relationship between the elements in the body and so on. It's like, well, what's that about? Well, it's attempts to describe more subtle processes which are happening in our daily life. But if we become aware of those, then we don't need to wait until the point where something will show up on a lab test.
Yeah. It's like we're using that kind of symbolic, imaginal language that can help us to access and understand what's going on. But also, even without those kind of systems that are doing that, so often when you talk to somebody about why they think they are experiencing what they're experiencing, they can follow the threads back. we can follow the threads back. And it's innate to us. Once we're given that space where we can start to question and sit in that and understand it more holistically, it starts to make sense to us. What we are doing or not doing, or residing in or not residing in within ourselves, that's led us to a place of imbalance. And that knowing is so precious to recover, because once we start to recover that, we can self-diagnose, we can course correct, we can self-adjust as we're going along. We start to have then this whole toolkit of ways in which we can impact our own health, our own well-being positively.
Yeah, it's much. I love this, because what we're able to do then is help people further upstream and much sooner, and it's more in the field of prevention than cure.
Yeah,
which is not. It's not so fashionable. There's not so much money in it, perhaps. I don't know. There's all manner of reasons why we tend to favor cure over prevention, but actually. I think that the healthier that we get and the more we understand, the more prevention makes sense. And the less it makes sense to leave things until they become physically manifest or so debilitating that we literally get stopped in our tracks by it. It just makes more sense to start to pay more attention to what's going on.
Because we are, very often seeing ourselves through a kind of a mechanical, functional medical system, and we don't associate what we do, what we choose to do, and how we choose to be and how we choose to live and respond on a daily basis. We don't acknowledge fully or realize fully the power of that. Then when we become ill or when we come out of balance and we do get to work with someone who can help us come back to that, and we start to put those pieces together and we start to realize how important our own choices are and how very much our well-being is in our own hands, then that is in itself a paradigm shift. It seems to make so much sense, and yet so few people are aware of that. So few people are aware of how much they can impact their own health positively.
Right. And or how much they're already impacting it, not necessarily positively. Yeah. No, I like that. So, I think that is an important part of the role that holistic practitioners are fulfilling. We in a sense, we're filling that gap for people, helping them to discover that they do have resources, they do have wisdom within themselves, and they do have the capacity to recognize when things are out of whack within themselves.
And maybe that's a really key thing, that as practitioners, that we can be that mediator between someone, their inner self and their body, and helping them to see how those two join up, where they join up.
Absolutely.
What that conversation is.
It's super helpful.
And then hopefully there'll come a time when that role is no longer needed. When we, certainly with individual clients, we want to make ourselves redundant. We want it to be that dialogue is there and is flowing and is fully apparent for them, and that they can reside in that themselves.
Within themselves.
We can just tweak that occasionally if they're struggling a bit, but the goal is that the person becomes independent and empowered to do that.
And that, I think, just to kind of complete the circle there, when someone reaches that place of understanding within themselves, and again, it's not a fixed place, it's an ongoing journey for all of us, but when they have sufficient depth of understanding to recognize some of their own tendencies, their own susceptibilities, it's not about making all that go away. It's about recognizing that we all have different body types, we've got strengths, we've got weaknesses, we've got inherited tendencies, we've got psychological tendencies. That's part of the human condition. So it's kind of learning to live with your own package in a way that is healthy within the bounds of what's possible for you. When someone has that relationship to themselves and that degree of understanding, if they do get sick with something that requires, let's say, surgery or something of that kind, they're in a much better position to know what to do then. But it doesn't obviate the need to sometimes go and use the medical system, the things that they may not have had to have any dealings with for a long time. They've learned to look after themselves instead of taking antibiotics every time. They just know that they need to rest. They need to maybe take some herbs or something of that kind that they know are good for them. They've found what is their own good medicine. That doesn't mean that at a certain point they might not need some other kind of medical treatment or intervention. But if they do, they're in a really good place to be able to listen in, to be very selective about what kind of practitioner, what kind of treatment, and the outcome is much more likely to be positive. That's what I've noticed, because they're not going into it blind, and they're not going into it disempowered. They're not going into it with the attitude, this is nothing to do with me, you fix me, doc.
Exactly.
It's a totally different ballgame. Even though they might end up having as I say, a medical intervention of some kind, the person is recognizing, okay, this is beyond the limits of what I know that I can self-heal right now. So I'm going to buy myself some time and do this. And it's more of a conscious choice. And it's coming from an empowered place. So again, nothing gets excluded from that. Holistic means you include more. It doesn't mean it doesn't mean, oh, that person must never have surgery, must never take this, must never. No, it's not that.
No,
it's that you recognize its rightful place. But very often what has become the default treatment shouldn't be the starting point, really. It's the end point.
And it in itself isn't the end.
Right. We know what that means.
We know what that means. Hopefully everyone else does. And maybe that's a good point too.
I think that could be the end, but I'm not sure. It's only the end of this conversation. There's always scope for another. So thank you, Rachel. It's an interesting topic to unpack, and it's not one that I've really had this conversation with for, I don't know, we'll say for a long time. I can't remember ever. So it's a nice thing to consider, and I hope there's been something in there for people that's helpful.
Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.